The moment Professor Williams looked at me and said, "I don't think you belong in advanced biochemistry," I felt something inside me crack. Not break, crack. Like ice under pressure, still holding but forever changed. Which country are you listening from? Tell us in the comments below. My name is Maya, and 3 years ago I thought I had everything figured out. I was 26, living in Boston, Massachusetts, with a small apartment overlooking the Charles River. Every morning I'd watch the rowing teams glide across the water while sipping coffee from my favorite mug, a gift from my grandmother that read "Future Scientist" in faded letters. I had worked for 4 years as a research assistant at a pharmaceutical company after completing my bachelor's degree in chemistry. The work was good, steady, and I was saving money for graduate school. During those years, I had contributed to 3 major drug development projects, learning to navigate the complex world of pharmaceutical research. My colleagues respected my analytical skills, and I had earned 2 company achievement awards for my contributions to enzyme stability studies. My dream was simple: earn a PhD in biochemistry and eventually run my own research lab. I wanted to develop treatments for genetic disorders, inspired by watching my younger brother struggle with sickle cell disease throughout our childhood. I remembered countless nights in hospital waiting rooms, watching him endure pain crises. The doctors would explain how a single amino acid change in his hemoglobin caused his red blood cells to sickle and block blood flow. Even as a teenager, I was fascinated by how something so small could have such profound consequences. Life in Boston felt like a fresh start. I had grown up in a small town in Alabama where opportunities were limited, and being one of the few black families meant we often stood out in ways that weren't always comfortable. I remembered the subtle looks when we walked into restaurants, the guidance counselor who suggested I consider more practical career paths than science. But my grandmother had always pushed back against those limitations. "Maya," she would say, "the world is bigger than this little town, and you're too smart to let anyone make you small." Boston was different, or so I thought. It was a city of universities, of brilliant minds, of possibilities. Here I believed merit would speak louder than appearance. The apartment I found was tiny but perfect. A studio on the 4th floor of a converted brownstone in Cambridge. From my single window, I could see the Charles River and the Harvard crew teams practicing in the early morning mist. I had been accepted into the graduate program at a prestigious university after 3 application cycles. The rejections from my first 2 attempts had stung, but I used them as motivation to strengthen my application. I published 2 papers from my pharmaceutical research, volunteered at local science museums teaching chemistry to middle school students, and earned stellar scores on my graduate entrance exams. The rejection letters from my first attempts had been devastating. "While your qualifications are impressive," one had read, "we received an unusually strong pool of applicants this year." Each rejection felt personal, like a judgment not just on my credentials but on my potential. But my grandmother had taught me persistence. "Baby," she said after the second round of rejections, "sometimes the world needs time to catch up to what you already know about yourself." When that acceptance letter finally arrived, I called my grandmother first. She had raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 12, and she had worked 3 jobs to make sure my brother and I could focus on our education. "Baby," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "you're going to be the first doctor in our family. Not the medical kind but the scientist kind. That's something special." I felt invincible walking onto campus for the first time. The brick buildings seemed to whisper stories of discoveries and breakthroughs. This was where I belonged. This was where I would prove that a girl from rural Alabama could contribute something meaningful to science. My first semester went smoothly. I took foundational courses, connected with other graduate students, and even joined a research lab focused on protein folding. My advisor, Dr. Chin, was encouraging and seemed impressed with my work ethic. I was building the life I had dreamed of. But then came spring semester, and with it, advanced biochemical analysis, the course that would change everything. Professor Williams was a legend in the biochemistry department. He had discovered 3 major enzymatic pathways, held over 20 patents, and had trained dozens of successful researchers. His advanced course was notoriously difficult but highly respected. Getting in was competitive, staying in was even harder. I had prepared for months. I read every paper he had published, reviewed advanced textbooks, and even attended his public lectures the previous semester. When registration opened, I was among the first to sign up. The first day of class, I arrived 15 minutes early. The lecture hall was smaller than I expected, maybe 30 seats total. I chose a spot in the 3rd row, close enough to show engagement but not so close as to seem presumptuous. I arranged my notebook, pens, and laptop with the careful precision of someone who had earned their place there. Other students filtered in gradually. I recognized most of them, accomplished graduate students and a few exceptional undergraduates. The atmosphere was serious, focused. Everyone knew this class would push them to their limits. Professor Williams entered at exactly 2 p.m. He was a tall, thin man in his 60s with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He wore a perfectly pressed button-down shirt and moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in any room. He didn't introduce himself. Everyone knew who he was. Instead, he began writing a complex molecular structure on the whiteboard, his movements precise and economical. "This semester we will explore the frontiers of biochemical analysis," he said without turning around. "We will examine techniques that most researchers never master, theories that challenge conventional thinking, and problems that have no easy solutions." He finished the drawing and turned to face us. His eyes swept the room slowly, assessing each student. When his gaze reached me, it paused. Just for a moment, but long enough for me to notice the slight furrow in his brow. "The work we do here will separate the serious scientists from those who are merely playing at research," he continued. "I have high standards and I do not accept anything less than excellence." For the next hour he outlined the syllabus. 3 major research projects, weekly presentations, and a final paper that would require original data analysis. It was exactly what I had expected, challenging but manageable for someone with my background. After class I approached his desk. Several other students had the same idea, forming a small line to ask questions or introduce themselves. I waited patiently, reviewing my notes and thinking about which research project might best align with my interests. When my turn came, I stepped forward with what I hoped was a confident but respectful demeanor. "Professor Williams, I'm Maya Thompson. I wanted to thank you for accepting me into the course. I'm particularly interested in your recent work on enzyme kinetics, and I was wondering if—" He held up a hand, stopping me mid-sentence. His expression had shifted from neutral to something I couldn't quite identify. Concern? Doubt. "Miss Thompson," he said, his voice measured but cool, "I want to be sure you understand what you're getting into here. This is an advanced course designed for students with extensive biochemical backgrounds. The mathematical requirements alone can be overwhelming." I felt my smile falter slightly. "I understand, sir. I've reviewed the prerequisites and I have a strong foundation in—" "The prerequisites are the minimum," he interrupted again. "The reality is much more demanding. I've found that students from certain backgrounds sometimes struggle with the theoretical complexity. I wouldn't want you to be discouraged when the material becomes challenging." The words hit me like a physical blow. Certain backgrounds. The phrase hung in the air between us, loaded with implications he didn't need to state explicitly. "I appreciate your concern," I managed, my voice steadier than I felt, "but I'm confident in my abilities. I've been working in biochemical research for 4 years and—" "Industry work is quite different from academic rigor," he said, gathering his papers with deliberate motions. "Perhaps you might consider auditing the course first to see if it's really suitable for you. There's no shame in recognizing one's limitations." The other students in line had grown quiet, probably sensing the tension. I could feel their eyes on me, watching this exchange with the uncomfortable fascination of people witnessing something they knew was wrong but didn't know how to address. "I'll be staying in the course," I said, my voice carrying more force than I had intended. "I earned my place here and I intend to prove that I belong." Professor Williams's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or irritation at my refusal to accept his subtle dismissal. "As you wish," he said finally. "But don't say I didn't warn you." I walked out of that lecture hall with my head held high, but inside I was reeling. 4 years of research experience, stellar grades, glowing recommendations. None of it seemed to matter. In Professor Williams's eyes, I was defined by something entirely beyond my control, the color of my skin. That evening I called my grandmother. I tried to keep my voice light, but she knew me too well. "Baby, what's wrong? You sound like you're carrying the world on your shoulders." I told her everything. The professor's words, his tone, the way he had dismissed my qualifications before even looking at my transcripts. By the time I finished, I was crying, something I rarely did. "Maya," she said softly, "I want you to listen to me carefully. That man doesn't get to decide your worth. You know who you are and you know what you're capable of. Sometimes people will try to make you small because your success makes them uncomfortable. Don't you dare let them." Her words steadied me, but they couldn't erase the hurt. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if I had made a mistake. Maybe I wasn't ready for this level of academic rigor. Maybe Professor Williams was right to doubt me. But then I remembered something my grandmother had told me years ago. Doubt is like rust, baby. If you let it sit too long, it'll eat right through your dreams. I wouldn't let that happen. Not now, not after coming this far. The weeks that followed were the most challenging of my academic life, but not for the reasons Professor Williams had predicted. The coursework was demanding, yes, but I had been right about my preparation. The mathematical concepts were complex but manageable, the research techniques were advanced but learnable, and the theoretical frameworks were challenging but fascinating. The real difficulty was the constant, subtle undermining from Professor Williams. During my first presentation, a detailed analysis of protein conformational changes, I noticed his skeptical expression before I even began speaking. As I explained my methodology, he interrupted with questions that seemed designed to fluster rather than clarify. Are you certain about those calculations, Miss Thompson? The error bars seem optimistic. I had triple-checked every number, but his tone made me second-guess myself. I used the standard deviation method outlined in the Henderson paper from 2019. Yes, well, statistical analysis requires a certain level of mathematical sophistication. Perhaps you could review your work and present again next week. Several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. My analysis was solid, better than solid, it was innovative. I had found a pattern in the data that others had missed, a correlation that could lead to new understanding of protein behavior under stress conditions. I'm confident in my analysis, Professor Williams. If you have specific concerns about my methodology, I'd be happy to address them. He seemed surprised by my directness. For a moment, the room was completely silent. Then, with visible reluctance, he moved on to the next student. After class, two of my classmates approached me, Jennifer, a second-year PhD student, and Marcus, who was working on his master's thesis. That was incredible work, Jennifer said quietly. I've been struggling with protein conformational analysis for months, and you explained concepts I hadn't even considered. Marcus nodded enthusiastically. Your statistical approach was brilliant. I've never seen anyone pick up on those patterns so quickly. Their support meant everything, but it also highlighted how obvious Professor Williams's bias had become. Other students were noticing the disparity between my actual performance and his responses to my work. The pattern continued week after week. When other students made minor errors in their presentations, Professor Williams would offer gentle corrections and encouraging guidance. Interesting approach, David. Have you considered adjusting your control variables? Or, good work, Sarah. Perhaps exploring the literature on enzyme kinetics might strengthen your analysis. His tone with them was collaborative, supportive, treating mistakes as learning opportunities rather than evidence of incompetence. When I presented, even when my work was flawless, he found reasons to question my competence. During my second presentation on protein folding dynamics, I had spent weeks developing a novel computational model that predicted folding patterns with remarkable accuracy. The mathematics were complex, involving multiple differential equations and statistical regression analyses, but I had checked and rechecked every calculation. Miss Thompson, Professor Williams interrupted midway through my explanation, are you certain about these computational results? The predictions seem rather ambitious for someone new to protein modeling. I paused, feeling the familiar tightness in my chest. I verified the calculations using 3 different software packages, Professor Williams. The model is based on established thermodynamic principles, and the results align with experimental data from the literature. Software packages can be unreliable if not properly understood, he said, his voice carrying that particular tone of condescension I had come to dread. Perhaps you should have consulted with more experienced researchers before presenting such complex analyses. Jennifer, sitting in the front row, raised her hand tentatively. Actually, Professor Williams, I think Maya's approach is really innovative. I've been working on similar problems for 2 years, and I've never seen anyone integrate thermodynamic modeling with kinetic data so elegantly. Professor Williams's expression hardened slightly. Miss Chin, while enthusiasm is admirable, we must maintain rigorous standards for computational work. Complexity isn't the same as correctness. The dismissal hung in the air like smoke. He wasn't just questioning my work. He was suggesting that any support for it came from naivety rather than recognition of its quality. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, but I maintained my composure. I'd be happy to share my methodology and source code with anyone who'd like to review it, I said, my voice steady despite the anger building inside me. That won't be necessary, Professor Williams replied curtly. Let's move on to the next presentation. During a laboratory session on enzyme purification, I developed a modification to the standard protocol that increased yield by 15%. The breakthrough had come to me during a late-night review of the molecular literature, when I realized that adjusting the pH buffer system during the final purification step could stabilize the enzyme structure more effectively. I had tested the modification carefully, running parallel experiments with the standard protocol as a control. The results were undeniable. My modified approach consistently produced higher yields with greater protein stability. Other students gathered around my lab bench to see the data, asking questions about my methodology with genuine excitement. "Maya, this is incredible," said Marcus, studying my gel electrophoresis results. "You've increased purity by almost 20% too. How did you think to adjust the buffer composition?" I was explaining the molecular reasoning behind my approach when Professor Williams approached our group. Instead of acknowledging the innovation, his first response was skepticism. "Exceptional results often indicate exceptional mistakes," he said, loud enough for the entire lab to hear. The conversations around nearby lab benches quieted as other students turned to listen. "I'd recommend repeating the procedure using the established protocol. Sometimes enthusiasm can lead to errors in measurement or documentation." The words stung not just because of their implications, but because of the public nature of the dismissal. Professor Williams wasn't just questioning my results privately, he was undermining my credibility in front of my peers, suggesting that my success was more likely due to error than skill. "I've run the experiment 5 times now," I said, keeping my voice professional despite the frustration building inside me. "Each time with appropriate controls. The results are consistent and reproducible." "Well," Professor Williams said with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes, "I suppose we'll see if these results hold up under more rigorous scrutiny. Sometimes what appears to be an improvement is simply measurement artifact." I repeated the experiment 3 times more, each time achieving the same improved results. I documented every step meticulously, took photographs of each gel, and even asked Jennifer to witness one of the runs to verify my methodology. When I presented my findings to the class the following week, the data was irrefutable. Professor Williams's response was lukewarm at best. "Interesting," he said, his tone suggesting it was anything but. "Though I wonder if these results would be reproducible in other hands. Individual technique can sometimes create the illusion of improvement where none actually exists." The implication was clear and cruel. My success was either accidental or unreliable, that I couldn't be trusted to consistently produce quality work, and that other researchers wouldn't be able to replicate my findings. It was a fundamental attack on my competence as a scientist. But perhaps the most painful moment came during office hours. I had stayed after class to discuss my research project proposal, a study examining enzyme behavior in high-stress cellular environments. The proposal built on my years of pharmaceutical research experience and represented what I believed could be a significant contribution to the field. I had spent 3 weeks crafting the 20-page document, reviewing dozens of recent papers, and developing a comprehensive methodology that addressed potential limitations I had identified in existing research. The proposed study would examine how enzymes maintain functionality under the oxidative stress conditions commonly found in disease states. This was cutting-edge work that could have implications for drug development, particularly for conditions like my brother's sickle cell disease where oxidative stress played a major role in cellular damage. Professor Williams barely glanced at the document I had spent weeks perfecting. He flipped through the pages quickly, spending perhaps 30 seconds reviewing what represented hours of careful thought and analysis. "Miss Thompson, I think you might be overreaching with this project," he said, setting the proposal aside without even reaching the methodology section. "The biochemical complexity alone would challenge even our most advanced students. The enzyme kinetics you're proposing to study are notoriously difficult to measure accurately, and the cellular stress models require sophisticated equipment and techniques." He paused, removing his glasses to clean them with deliberate slowness. "Perhaps something more straightforward would be appropriate for your first major research effort. Something that would allow you to build foundational skills before attempting more complex investigations." He handed me a pre-written project description from a stack on his desk. A basic analysis of well-established enzymatic reactions involving lysozyme activity in bacterial cell walls. It was the kind of work an undergraduate might do for a senior thesis, not a graduate student in an advanced course. The irony wasn't lost on me. Lysozyme had been studied extensively for decades. There was virtually no possibility of contributing new knowledge to the field. "But Professor Williams, I have extensive experience with the techniques required for my proposed project. In my previous research at the pharmaceutical company, I worked with similar enzyme systems under stress conditions, and I've already identified the specific methodological challenges and potential solutions. Industry experience and academic research are quite different, as I've mentioned before, he interrupted, his voice taking on an edge of impatience. The intellectual rigor required for original research is substantial. Companies are often satisfied with results that might not meet academic standards for thoroughness and reproducibility. The insult was barely veiled. He was suggesting that my 4 years of pharmaceutical research, work that had contributed to FDA-approved drug formulations, wasn't intellectually rigorous enough to prepare me for real, academic research. I understand the differences between industry and academic research, I said, trying to keep my voice level. That's precisely why I've designed this study to address the limitations I observed in commercial applications. The methodology I'm proposing would generate publishable results that could advance both theoretical understanding and practical applications. Professor Williams leaned back in his chair, studying me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Miss Thompson, I appreciate your ambition. But one of the most important skills for a young researcher to develop is realistic self-assessment. Knowing one's limitations isn't a weakness, it's essential for long-term success in science. The implication was devastating and clear. He didn't believe I was intellectually capable of handling challenging work. Despite my qualifications, despite my performance in his class, despite my proven track record, he saw me as someone who needed simpler tasks, someone whose reach exceeded her grasp, someone who lacked the self-awareness to recognize her own limitations. I left his office that day feeling smaller than I had in years. The confident woman who had walked into his classroom months earlier was being slowly eroded by constant doubt and dismissal. I began to question not just my abilities but my right to be there at all. That evening, I found myself staring at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, wondering what Professor Williams saw when he looked at me. I saw a scientist, someone who had worked tirelessly to understand the molecular mechanisms of life. But apparently he saw something else entirely. The breaking point came during a group discussion about research methodologies. I had suggested an innovative approach to data analysis that could reveal patterns invisible to traditional methods. The suggestion was met with excited interest from my classmates, who immediately began brainstorming applications. Professor Williams listened to the discussion with a frown that deepened with each enthusiastic comment from other students. "Let's not get carried away," he said finally. "Untested methodologies can lead to questionable conclusions. Miss Thompson, while I appreciate your creativity, scientific research requires proven approaches." Jennifer spoke up immediately. "But Professor Williams, Maya's suggestion is based on solid statistical principles. The methodology she's describing could revolutionize how we analyze protein interactions." "Miss Chin," he replied, his voice taking on a sharp edge, "I think you'll find that experience teaches us to be cautious about revolutionary claims. What seems innovative to inexperienced researchers often proves to be naive in practice." The condescension in his voice was no longer subtle. He wasn't just questioning my methodology, he was questioning my intelligence and my right to contribute ideas. Worse, he was using my classmates' support against me, suggesting that their enthusiasm was evidence of their own inexperience rather than recognition of a good idea. I felt something shift inside me during that moment. The hurt and doubt that had been building for weeks crystallized into something harder, stronger. I realized that Professor Williams wasn't just biased against me, he was threatened by me. My success challenged whatever assumptions he had made about who belonged in his elite academic circle. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I was done trying to prove myself worthy of basic respect. Instead, I was going to prove that his assumptions were not just wrong but embarrassingly so. I was going to show him, and everyone else, exactly who Maya Thompson really was. The opportunity for vindication came sooner than I expected, in the form of the National Biochemistry Research Symposium, a prestigious conference where leading researchers presented their latest findings. Professor Williams announced that he would be presenting his recent work on enzyme optimization, and he invited students to submit abstracts for poster presentations. Most students saw this as an honor just to be considered. For me, it was the perfect stage to demonstrate my capabilities beyond any doubt. I spent the next 3 weeks developing a comprehensive research presentation based on the enzyme modification work I had done in lab, the work Professor Williams had dismissed as probably erroneous. I expanded the research, testing my modification against 12 different enzyme systems and documenting improvements across multiple metrics. I worked 18-hour days running experiments and analyzing data. The results were extraordinary. My modified protocol consistently improved enzyme efficiency by 15 to 30%, reduced reaction time by up to 40%, and maintained stability under stress conditions that normally caused standard preparations to fail. More importantly, I had identified the specific molecular mechanisms responsible for these improvements. I spent countless hours reviewing every relevant paper published in the last 5 years, ensuring that my work built appropriately on existing knowledge while clearly articulating its novel contributions. I developed sophisticated statistical analyses and created detailed molecular models to explain the mechanisms involved. I submitted my abstract without telling Professor Williams about the scope of my research. As far as he knew, I was presenting a simple poster about basic enzyme purification. Exactly the kind of straightforward work he thought appropriate for someone like me. The symposium was held at a major convention center in Chicago. Hundreds of researchers from universities and pharmaceutical companies around the world would be attending. As I set up my poster on the first morning, I felt a familiar mixture of nerves and excitement. My presentation was positioned in the graduate student section, surrounded by work from other promising young researchers. But within an hour of the session opening, something unexpected began happening. Senior researchers, professors, industry leaders, people whose names I recognized from landmark papers, started stopping at my poster. The first was Dr. Elizabeth Kovac from Stanford, a leading expert in enzyme engineering. She studied my data for several minutes before speaking. "This is remarkable work," she said. "The efficiency improvements you're documenting could have massive implications for industrial applications. Have you published these findings yet?" Before I could answer, she was calling over colleagues. "David, come look at this. This student has found a way to optimize enzyme activity that could revolutionize bioprocessing." Word spread quickly through the conference. By afternoon, I had a constant crowd around my poster. Researchers were taking pictures of my data, asking for copies of my protocols, and discussing collaboration opportunities. Dr. James Martinez from the National Institutes of Health spent 30 minutes discussing potential applications of my work. "We've been struggling with enzyme stability in one of our therapeutic development programs for rare genetic disorders," he explained. "Your approach could be exactly what we need. Would you be interested in a research fellowship?" Dr. Susan Reeves from Genentech approached with equally enthusiastic interest. "Your methodology could revolutionize how we approach enzyme engineering in biopharmaceutical manufacturing," she said. "We'd like to discuss potential consulting opportunities." I was floating on adrenaline and disbelief. These were the leading minds in biochemistry, treating me not just as a peer, but as someone whose work could advance the entire field. Dr. Michael Chong from the University of California System asked detailed questions about my statistical methodology. "The way you've approached the kinetic analysis is particularly sophisticated," he said. "Are you planning to pursue doctoral studies? I'd very much like to discuss having you join our research group." And then I saw Professor Williams approaching my poster. He moved through the crowd with his characteristic confidence, probably wondering what all the fuss was about. I watched him navigate between clusters of animated researchers, his expression shifting from casual curiosity to puzzled interest as he got closer and began to overhear fragments of conversation. "Revolutionary approach to enzyme optimization. Could change how we think about protein engineering. This student has identified mechanisms we've overlooked for years." When he reached the front and saw me standing there in a sharp professional blazer next to my comprehensive data display, his expression shifted from curiosity to confusion to something I had never seen before: shock. His eyes moved from my face to the poster behind me, taking in the sophisticated molecular diagrams, the extensive data tables, the complex statistical analyses that filled every inch of the display. "Miss Thompson," he said slowly, his voice barely audible above the conference noise. His face had gone pale, and he seemed to be struggling to process what he was seeing. "This is your presentation?" "Yes, Professor Williams. This is the enzyme optimization work I've been developing this semester. The work you suggested might be the result of measurement errors." I watched him study the poster more carefully, his eyes moving across the detailed methodology section where I had outlined the molecular basis for my modifications. He lingered on the results section, where graphs and tables demonstrated the consistent improvements I had achieved across multiple enzyme systems. His scientific training couldn't deny the quality of what he was seeing, even as his biases struggled to reconcile it with his assumptions about me. Dr. Kovac, who was still standing nearby, turned to Professor Williams with obvious enthusiasm. "Are you this brilliant student's advisor? You must be incredibly proud." This is some of the most innovative enzyme work I've seen in years. The molecular insights alone represent a significant advance in our understanding of protein optimization. Professor Williams opened his mouth but no words came out. I could see him struggling with the cognitive dissonance of receiving praise for work he had consistently dismissed. I decided to help him, though not entirely out of kindness. Professor Williams teaches the advanced biochemistry course I'm taking. I developed this research as part of his class assignments. I kept my voice neutral, professional, but I made sure the nearby researchers could hear the context. Exceptional mentoring, Dr. Martinez added, joining the conversation. You've clearly created an environment where students can do their best work. Maya was just telling us about the potential therapeutic applications of her findings. The pharmaceutical implications alone could be groundbreaking. I watched Professor Williams process this information. His students were listening to these conversations, seeing him receive credit for work he had consistently dismissed. The same work he had suggested was too sophisticated for me to handle. The molecular mechanisms Maya has identified are particularly elegant, Dr. Kovac continued. The way she's mapped the conformational changes that drive increased efficiency shows real insight into protein behavior. You don't see this level of analysis from many graduate students. Maya has always been dedicated to her studies, Professor Williams managed, his voice strained. But the real revelation was yet to come. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the conference director, approached our group with purposeful strides. She was a legend in biochemistry, former Harvard department chair, author of the definitive textbook on enzyme kinetics, and winner of the National Science Foundation's highest research honor. "Excuse me," she said, addressing me directly. "Are you Maya Thompson?" "Yes, ma'am." "I've been reviewing your poster, and I have to ask, are you the same Maya Thompson who published the paper on pharmaceutical enzyme applications in the Journal of Applied Biochemistry last year?" My heart stopped. I had published that paper based on my industry research, but it had been released under my company's name with limited individual attribution. Most people wouldn't connect it to my academic work. "Yes, that's my research." Dr. Walsh smiled broadly. "I thought so. I used that paper in my graduate seminars. It's one of the most practical applications of enzyme optimization I've encountered. Your work on stability under manufacturing conditions was groundbreaking." She turned to Professor Williams. "You have a real treasure here. Maya's previous research has already influenced how we think about enzyme applications in pharmaceutical manufacturing. This new work could be even more significant." The color had drained from Professor Williams's face. He was beginning to understand exactly who he had been dismissing for the past months. Not a struggling student who needed simpler assignments, but an established researcher whose work was already influencing the field. "Dr. Walsh," I said carefully, "I should mention that I also have another paper being published next month in Molecular Engineering Reviews. It expands on some of the concepts I'm presenting here today." The crowd around my poster had grown larger, and several people began taking notes as I mentioned the upcoming publication. Professor Williams looked like he wanted to disappear entirely. Dr. Martinez pulled out his business card. "Maya, I'm serious about that fellowship opportunity. We need researchers who can bridge the gap between theoretical biochemistry and practical applications. Your background is exactly what we're looking for." As the afternoon continued, I collected business cards from 12 different research institutions, 3 pharmaceutical companies, and 2 government agencies. Multiple professors suggested I consider their programs for doctoral studies. A science journalist asked to interview me for an article about emerging researchers in biochemistry. Through it all, Professor Williams stood nearby, watching his assumptions crumble in real time. The student he had characterized as intellectually unprepared was being courted by the leading institutions in the field. The work he had dismissed as probably erroneous was being hailed as innovative and significant. But the moment that will stay with me forever came just before the session ended. Dr. Walsh approached me one more time, this time with a formal-looking document. "Maya, I hope you'll forgive the short notice, but we've decided to award you this year's Outstanding Graduate Research Recognition. It's given to one student whose work represents the highest standards of innovation and scientific rigor. The award came with a $1,000 prize and an invitation to present my research during the main conference session the following day." As Dr. Walsh handed me the certificate, the applause from the crowd was genuine and enthusiastic. Professor Williams was still standing there, but now he looked like a man who had just realized he had been standing in the presence of greatness while treating it as mediocrity. "Congratulations, Ms. Thompson," he said quietly as the crowd began to disperse. "This is quite an achievement." "Thank you, Professor Williams." I hope this demonstrates that I'm capable of handling the intellectual rigor of academic research. He met my eyes for the first time in months, and what I saw there wasn't hostility or skepticism anymore. It was something much more complex: embarrassment, regret, and perhaps the beginning of respect. "Yes," he said simply. "It certainly does." The presentation the following day was the culmination of everything I had worked toward. Standing on the main stage in front of 800 of the world's leading biochemists, I felt the weight of everyone who had ever doubted me, and everyone who had believed in me despite those doubts. I presented my research with confidence born from years of preparation and months of proving myself. The audience was engaged, asking thoughtful questions and offering collaboration suggestions. When I finished, the applause was sustained and genuine. After my presentation, Professor Williams approached me backstage. He looked older somehow, as if the events of the past 2 days had forced him to confront some uncomfortable truths about himself. "Maya," he said, using my first name for the first time, "I owe you an apology. I made assumptions about your capabilities that were not just wrong but harmful. Your work this semester, and clearly for years before you ever entered my classroom, has been exceptional. I was blind to your abilities, and that blindness was rooted in biases I should have recognized and addressed long ago." I studied his face, looking for signs of insincerity or self-serving motivation. What I saw instead was genuine remorse and what appeared to be the beginning of real self-reflection. "I appreciate that, Professor Williams. But I need you to understand that your assumptions didn't just affect me. They affected every student in that classroom who watched how you treated me. They learned that bias is acceptable if it's subtle enough, that intellectual merit can be overshadowed by prejudice, and that some people have to work twice as hard for half the recognition." He nodded slowly. "You're absolutely right. I failed not just you, but every student who trusted me to create an environment where excellence could flourish regardless of who achieved it. The question is what you're going to do differently going forward. I've already spoken with the department chair about implementing bias training for all faculty. I want to review my teaching methods, my evaluation criteria, everything. And if you're willing, I'd like you to be part of that process. Your perspective could help ensure that other students don't experience what you've experienced." It was more than I had expected, but exactly what was needed. Real change required acknowledgement, commitment, and ongoing effort, not just a private apology. "I'll consider it," I said. "But any process like that needs to include other students and faculty members who understand these issues. It can't just be one person's experience driving the change." "Of course. And Maya, I want you to know that your work this semester earned you an A+ in my course. Your research, your presentations, your intellectual contributions. Everything was exceptional from the beginning. I should have recognized that immediately. The grade mattered less than the acknowledgement." Professor Williams was finally seeing my work for what it had always been: excellent. Word of my conference success spread quickly through the university. Dr. Chin, my research advisor, offered me additional lab space for my enzyme optimization work. The biochemistry department nominated me for several national fellowships. Most importantly, other students began approaching me for advice and collaboration, recognizing me as a peer whose opinions and expertise had value. The change in Professor Williams's behavior was immediate and obvious. In our remaining class sessions, he engaged with my ideas thoughtfully, asked genuine questions about my research, and even incorporated some of my methodological suggestions into his own work. He began citing my conference presentation in his lectures, crediting me by name for the innovations I had developed. But perhaps the most meaningful change was in how he interacted with all students. The subtle biases that had colored his teaching for years became deliberate inclusion efforts. He created opportunities for every student to showcase their strengths, established clear evaluation criteria that focused on intellectual merit, and made his expectations transparent rather than subjective. 3 months later, I received an email that would change my life's trajectory. Dr. Walsh, the conference director who had presented me with the Outstanding Graduate Research Recognition, was offering me a position as a research fellow at the National Science Foundation. The fellowship would fund my doctoral studies while allowing me to develop my enzyme optimization work into a full research program. "Your combination of theoretical sophistication and practical application is exactly what science needs," her email read. "We believe your research could fundamentally change how we approach enzyme engineering in biotechnology applications." I called my grandmother immediately. "Baby, tell me everything," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice before I even began speaking. I told her about the fellowship, about the recognition my work was receiving, about Professor Williams's transformation and apology. When I finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Maya, do you remember what I told you when you first started that class? When that professor made you feel small? You told me that doubt was like rust and I couldn't let it eat through my dreams. That's right. But there's something else I want you to remember now. Success isn't just about proving other people wrong. It's about proving yourself right. You always knew who you were, baby. The rest of the world just needed time to catch up. She was right. Professor Williams's initial treatment had been painful and wrong, but it hadn't defined my worth or my capabilities. Those had always existed, independent of his recognition or approval. What had changed wasn't who I was, but how others saw me, and more importantly, how I had learned to demand the respect I deserved. My last interaction with Professor Williams came during the final class session. After presenting the results of my semester-long research project, work that had evolved into the foundation for my fellowship research, he asked me to stay after other students had left. Maya, I've been thinking about our conversation after the conference, and I wanted you to know that you've changed how I understand teaching and research mentorship. I've been a professor for 22 years, and I thought I understood how to identify and nurture scientific talent. You showed me that I was only seeing part of the picture. I'm glad it was a learning experience for both of us. I want to ask you something, and please be honest. If you could go back to the beginning of this semester knowing what you know now, would you still have taken my course? I considered the question carefully. The semester had been difficult in ways that had nothing to do with the academic content. I had been forced to prove myself repeatedly, to withstand doubt and dismissal, to fight for recognition that should have been freely given. But I had also discovered strengths I didn't know I possessed. I had learned to advocate for myself with confidence and dignity. I had developed research that was now gaining national attention. Most importantly, I had refused to let someone else's limitations become my own. Yes, I said finally. But not because of how you treated me initially. I would take it again because of how I responded to that treatment. Because of how I insisted on being seen for who I really am. Because sometimes the most important discoveries happen when we're forced to prove what we're truly capable of. Professor Williams smiled, the first genuine smile I had ever seen from him. That, he said, is exactly the kind of wisdom that makes you an exceptional scientist and an exceptional person. As I write this story, I'm preparing to defend my doctoral dissertation. My research on enzyme optimization has been published in 4 major journals, cited by researchers around the world, and licensed by 3 pharmaceutical companies for commercial development. The fellowship that began with Dr. Walsh's recognition has led to opportunities one never could have imagined when I first walked into Professor Williams's classroom. Last month, I received news that my enzyme optimization technology is being used in the development of a new treatment for sickle cell disease, the condition that first inspired my interest in biochemistry. The researchers at Johns Hopkins who are leading the clinical trial reached out to thank me for the foundational work that made their therapeutic approach possible. My brother, now 28 and working as a teacher, was the first person I called with the news. Maya, he said, his voice thick with emotion, you remember all those nights in the hospital when we were kids? You used to ask the doctors so many questions about the science behind my condition. I never imagined those questions would lead to you helping develop better treatments. But the most important lesson from my experience with Professor Williams wasn't about enzymes or research or academic success. It was about the difference between proving your worth and knowing your worth. 4 months, I had focused on proving to Professor Williams that I belonged in his classroom, that I was capable of advanced work, that I deserved basic respect. I measured my success by his approval and felt diminished by his dismissal. I was letting someone else's biases define my reality. The transformation came when I stopped trying to prove myself to him and started proving myself to myself. When I focused on doing exceptional work because that's who I am, not because I needed his validation. When I demanded respect because I knew I deserved it, not because I hoped he would eventually grant it. That shift, from seeking approval to claiming what was already mine, changed everything. My research flourished because I was pursuing my own vision rather than trying to meet someone else's limited expectations. My confidence grew because it was rooted in my own knowledge of my capabilities rather than external recognition. My relationships with peers improved because I was showing up as my authentic self rather than a version of myself designed to avoid disapproval. Professor Williams's assumptions about me were wrong, but they were also irrelevant. My worth as a scientist and as a person existed independently of his recognition. The tragedy wasn't that he doubted me, it was that I allowed his doubt to make me doubt myself. Today, when I work with younger students facing similar challenges, I tell them this. Other people's limitations are not your limitations. Other people's biases are not your reality. Other people's inability to see your worth is not evidence that you lack worth. The world will test you. People will make assumptions about what you're capable of based on how you look, where you come from, what opportunities you've had or haven't had. Some of those people will be in positions of power, able to open or close doors that seem important to your future. But here's what I learned in Professor Williams's classroom. The most important door, the one that leads to your own potential, can only be opened from the inside. No one else holds that key. No one else can turn that lock. Your dreams, your capabilities, your future, they belong to you. They judged me by my appearance and made assumptions about my mind. I showed them the power of never accepting someone else's limitations as my own. The professor called me unfit for his class until he saw my research credentials. But I was always fit for that class, fit for that research, fit for the recognition that eventually came. The only thing that changed was his ability to see what had always been there. And that's the truth I want you to remember. You don't become worthy when others recognize your worth. You are always worthy. You're just waiting for the world to catch up. Your dreams don't need permission. Your potential doesn't need approval. Your worth doesn't need validation. Trust in who you are. Demand the respect you deserve. And never, ever let someone else's rust eat through your dreams. The enzyme optimization research that Professor Williams once dismissed as probably erroneous is now being used in laboratories around the world. The student he thought wasn't intellectually prepared for advanced work is now training the next generation of biochemical researchers. But the real victory wasn't proving him wrong. It was never letting him be right about who I was supposed to be. Remember, they can doubt your abilities, question your qualifications, and challenge your dreams. But they cannot diminish your worth unless you give them permission to do so. Never give them that permission. The world needs exactly who you are, exactly as you are, exactly when you're ready to show them. And you're always ready. You just have to believe it first.